And the other thing I mentioned in my previous video was, at my time, my Christian calling was to run a hostel for homeless young men. So I'd taken in Brian Goodman, Gavin Wilson or Cooley, and Dale Oakley. So I had the use of a 4-bedroom house I'd bought from my mother. Now, everybody, I lived in what we call the 5 Bridges community in Diss. You either have to go over a bridge or under a bridge to come into that part of Diss. And I lived opposite Victoria Road Post Office. You had the bakers with Richard Hayden, who was Inspector Hayden's son. We had a corner shop. I will take some photos of that area to give you an idea where I was. But even with the youths I was working with in Diss, I was also running a drop-in centre, to help with young people. Omar Holmes gave us the use of their old canteen. Simon's coaches, who I was driving for at the time, used to let me have a bus, so I'd go and pick up youths from Dickleborough, surrounding villages, and bring them into Diss to Centreford. Dickleborough at the time, where I was also doing a milk round, had the highest crime rate of any village in Norfolk. So beginning to work with them and getting them out of drugs and drink and crime. But one thing I've always been aware of, prior to this, I'd also lived in Spain, in the Andalus, and worked in rehabilitation work for heroin addicts. That is when AIDS was then really coming onto the threshold, so we were in the forefront of working with not just heroin addicts but AIDS victims, so you sort of became a bit of a leper colony. But one thing I've always been more aware of, and then even going back prior to that, I was in the Merchant Navy, travelled the world, 20 countries. It's again the unexpected when you least expect it, but one youth with a knife, one youth with a gun, even the youths I was working with in Diss were carrying knives. One in particular was carrying a machete. They had found a camper van in Norwich that had quite a large, that they'd stolen off other drug dealers in Norwich, had quite a large lump, 10,000 in cash in the camper van. And the gang from Norwich, the drug gang, were hunting the lads from Dickleborough down with machetes, and that did come to a confrontation. And one particular lad, he was carrying a machete in Dickleborough as a deterrent. So, and this was, so I'm very aware that, and even the knife crime in the UK recently has just escalated. Acid attacks, knife attacks, stabbing recently in Bury St Edmunds, in Ipswich. So it's never been any rocket science that one one particularly, you get a demon possessed youth, someone filled with evil and become very violent and armed with a weapon can cause you a big problem, or someone you love a big problem. So a Jaffa and his Yardie gang threatening to burn my mother alive. I'm all packed, I'm ready to go. Now the interesting thing was, where I was running a hostel in Victoria Road, I say, a very self-contained community down that end of Victoria Road. Excuse me. We had 3 big haulage yards, MRCT, Bartram's, Trans Am, with the Railway Tavern, pub, fish and chip shop, builders merchants, 2 big builders merchants down there. So it's quite a big community for that end of the town. But rumours and gossip, especially with the shops, and the post office was the big gossip. Richard Hayden's bakers, and people are all for young people. As I say, I'd worked in drug rehabilitation in Spain, and seeing people getting their lives back and getting free from heroin, and seeing the transformation that took place in their lives is a nice thing to see. And when you see youths turning their lives around, coming out of drugs, coming out of crime, drink, violence, it's a good thing. So, but the thing is, people are all for people turning their lives around, but just not on their doorstep. My neighbours and this community were really opposed to me running an open house, because youths used to come around from Dickleborough. People didn't particularly like, Brian and Gavin. Dale was not so bad, but Brian and Gavin had quite a bit of a reputation, so my neighbours were in uproar. You know, me running a hostel in the centre of this community, you know, this was going to devalue their houses. And the other thing too, false allegations will never throw away complaints and false, even though there was nothing really to complain about. If someone shut a door too late at night, or if the music was just a little bit too loud, you know, they were soon picking up phones, soon making accusations and allegations, which was a shame too, because I say some people I'd expect to try and stitch me up in this and have plenty to say. But later on, when it was people who'd watched me grow up, because I'd always lived there, I'd bought, you know, that's my parents' home and that's my mother's house after my dad died that I'd bought, so they'd all watched me grow up, they all knew me. So when later on, you know, things really began to swirl in this, when it was people who'd watched me grow up who were stitching me up, neighbours and people I'd considered friends, but such is life. So anyhow, I was all ready to go, and got on the flight on the Sunday. So I'm flying into Kisumu, Kenya, Africa. You land at Nairobi, then get a flight up to Kisumu, or a Paisi, a taxi or a bus. And I pick up a Sunday Times newspaper, and on the headlines of the Sunday Times newspaper, Western intelligence, not Johnny Botwright, Western intelligence are forecasting if South Africa collapses into civil war, 50,000 people could be massacred there in a few days. They'd found a fighting force of 5,000 Zulus, heavily trained by 2 Americans, heavily armed with automatic weapons, who were prepared to make war with the ANC and also the right-wing whites. There were only 10 days to the South African elections, where over 300 years of white rule and oppression and torture and concentration camps and everything that came with apartheid was being overturned. And the Africans were saying blatantly, this is enough, we've had enough now, this is the big turning point for Africa, we are going for our independence. And if whites start to gun down blacks and helicopter gunships go into Soweto, we are going to drive every European on the continent of Africa into the sea. That was, and at the same time, Rwanda, not far away, it was estimated that 50,000 people had been massacred there. Only an estimate, but that was at that time 50,000. So I was flying in. Now, also, as I was flying in, every plane was fully booked with people coming out, especially from South Africa. So when you're flying into a country and everyone's leaving the country, and also before I went in on, you know, I'd booked the flight on the Wednesday. Nigeria had flared into massive violence, especially against Christians and so forth, but Nigeria had flared. And on the Thursday, Burundi had flared into massacres. So everything can just start a big chain reaction. And the other thing, the other interesting thing, is almost like watching an alignment, things line up. In Africa they call it a tinderbox situation, and when the tinderbox goes, it's a bit like the wildfires in California at the moment. The wind is blowing so fast that it's outflanking the firemen. They can't handle it. They've got 60-mile-an-hour winds in California as I'm speaking now. And the fire, and that's the same within Africa, the tinderbox, once it goes, it can go so rapidly and the violence can spread so quickly you can't outrun it. You know, you just got to try and be in the right place at the right time, or if you've got prior knowledge the trouble's going to start, you, like everyone, as I was saying, everyone was leaving, every plane was fully booked, and there were only 10 days to go to the South African elections, and no one knew how it was going to go. But this was a report on the front page of the Sunday Times newspaper, giving this dire warning, you know, for South Africa. So when I arrived there, I got up to to Kisumu, and I'm met by Mum. She's pretty gaunt, because this is another thing to factor into the equation too. She'd only just had a hysterectomy, so she was in no fit state to tackle a big gang of lads in their late 20s who were threatening to burn her alive in her car the next time they saw her. Now she's standing there with some of the children, meets me at the airport. Now when I go out in Kisumu, and the first person who I see hanging off the back of a bus, I'm not racial prejudiced, I've got lots of Asian friends, African friends, I've travelled the world, I get on with anyone's welcome at my table, any creed, race, colour. But hanging off the back of a bus is a big yardie, and he shouts to me, "Go home to your own country, Musunga." That's the first. So, and Kisumu was cutting up fairly rough, because the other thing you now got to factor into the equation is there was dire famine at that time in that part of Kenya. And the Kenyan government were only distributing aid to where they held sway, where their support was. Because Kisumu was the stronghold of Ford Kenya, the opposition party, they were letting Kisumu starve. And when people get hungry, they get wild. People, you really see a change in people. When people start starving, then they start getting very, very wild. Also in the equation, heavy fighting in Sudan, heavy fighting down the Rift Valley, heavy fighting in northern Uganda. Now the tribes in northern Uganda are kinsmen to the tribes in northern Kenya, who are both at that time in opposition to their governments. And the elections were taking place in Uganda, and there was a lot of trouble expected there. All the four big warlords were rearing up. Elections can always bring a lot of problems. People now talking about an election in the UK, but the elections in Africa, can be a melting pot, as proved in 2008 in Kenya, when the streets of Kenya run with blood. But so everything was lining up. Uganda, the elections were on. Burundi had flared. The slaughter in Rwanda was just relentless. There were news reports, women, children, the elderly, mass graves. You could put the population of this into, 8,000 plus in mass graves. People were even hiding in mass graves to avoid being massacred. And this is day in, when you go to bed, when you wake up, not very far away. People, children, the elderly are being massacred. People are fleeing for their lives, and this is just this slaughter is just continuous. A real bloodlust, evil is manifested there, and that is complete genocide. So I go with my mum to the marketplace in her truck, and when we start getting near the marketplace, I see Mum getting very nervous, quite on edge. I see her getting quite, up, a bit stressed, uptight, because this is where Jaffa and his gang are, at the marketplace. And the way they earn a bit of money is helping unload things and load things, and they're sitting there on these sacks. When we arrived, there's some big sacks of something outside Kisumu marketplace. So when we pull up, Jaffa shouts over, "Oh," he says, "have you got your bodyguard?" to my mother. So I said, "Mum, you go into the market." She went into the indoor marketplace, and I walk over to Jaffa. Now he's looking pretty shocked, what's his, because Jaffa and his gang are well known in Kisumu, and they're not a gang you're gonna mess with. And so I walk over to Jaffa and I said, "Right, what's this beef that you've got with my mother?" And he's really taken back, on his territory, and I'm in his face, and they've threatened to burn my mother, a week or so before, and then suddenly, and I said, I'm not just her bodyguard, I'm her son too. So you tell me, what's the beef that you've got with my mother? So Jeff tries to, his excuses or what his explanation is. He says, well, no one cares whether we live or die, and they just saw my mother as a wealthy Westerner, which she wasn't wealthy. She, all the money she had, she was helping street children and orphans with. So, but they saw her as a wealthy Westerner, and they were venting all their anger and frustration and hate at her. She was a symbol of, for whatever reason, but that's who they had vented their anger and hate. And Jaffa said, no one cares whether we live or die, Even if we meet with misfortune, people laugh at us, which is true for most people. No one cares whether you live or die, if you're set up or you take a big hit. No one cares, no one blinks an eye, it's just a story. So, and then he shows me this big gang member. He's a bit like Tyson, he's a big block, he's got a big neck, and he's sitting there and he's been hit by a car on his foot. I don't know how it's happened, but he's got like quite a gaping hole on the side of his ankle, which is covered up by a dirty handkerchief. He's obviously in a lot of pain. He says, Jaffa said, like, no one cares, look at this lad. Obviously they cannot afford, they don't get National Health Service, they cannot afford any medical, going to a hospital, or the medical bills and that, so you suffer, you die in Africa, as you do in most third world countries. No medical assistance. So when Mum came out from the marketplace, put the supplies in the truck, I called her over. So she looks a bit hesitant, but she does come over. And I show her this lad's foot. So she goes back to the truck and she gets blue iodine and surgical gloves and starts to clean this lad's foot. A bit like Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. Here's this woman who they were going to burn alive in her car the next time they saw her. This is the big death threat, Barton death threat. Now showing this act of kindness. And this big lad is sitting there and the tears are running down his cheeks. He's broken by it. Here's this woman cleaning the wound on his foot with iodine, putting a clean dressing on it, because everyone knows that if he gets an infection in that foot, gets gangrene, he won't just lose his leg, because he won't be able to have the medical bill to lose it, to cut off amputate his foot or his leg. That's game over for him. He's going to die. And with her cleaning it with iodine and putting a clean dressing on, he's crying. This is the first act of kindness. And this whole situation now is being completely turned around by an act of kindness. And their hostility is just gone. And Jaffa declares to the whole marketplace that Jesus has done a miracle. Now, I wouldn't call it a miracle. A small miracle has taken place, because this gang that was really hostile and going to burn my mother, Jaffa is now declaring to the whole marketplace that Jesus has done a miracle. And for them, just this small act of kindness was a miracle, because no one had ever shown them any kindness. They've only known, they've been on the streets all their lives. All they've known is being beaten and abused, and it had turned them, to make them how they were. So now this whole situation was resolved. And in fact, whenever my mother went, after this time, whenever my mum went to the marketplace, if she had any problem with anybody, if anyone tried to rip her off, Jaffa and his gang had her back. So the whole situation was turned around 360 degrees. And the other interesting thing was too, my mother was due to go into Uganda. And I was hoping that she'd already gone in, but she hadn't. She'd waited for me to arrive to go into Uganda. But because of this delay, and again the corruption in churches and pastors, there are some lovely people in churches, and there are some really people filled with the Spirit of God, the power of God and love, and there are some other people who are very questionable. Now William, who was a pastor Mum was over and was affiliated with DC3, he was now doing a big number on my mother behind her back. When he knew she was going into Uganda, he was going to sign all her ministry and the paperwork as his ministry, even though that was her ministry. He wanted to get, to take control, to take charge, was ready to sign all the paperwork, and Mum was tipped off about this, so that put his plans on the shelf, to oversee her and overtake her ministry. And she was able to sign the paperwork. And again, this happened, just funny how the things that God can do, because even later on when her ministry grew, again, some Christian, William again, Mr. Newbury in this, Pete Collins, some other, a corrupt bishop there, tried to take over her ministry. And when this lady advocate, this attorney advocate, one of the top ones in Kenya, heard about this situation, she came to my mother's aid. And you know, barristers and attorneys and advocates are not cheap. She came to my mother's aid free of charge, and again overturned them trying to overtake her ministry. And they were making up false allegations, trying to get her deported, all sorts. But this woman came and stood with my mother, sent by God, and their scam, what they were trying to pull off against my mother, was thwarted, and she won the day and kept her ministry. And you know, so like I say, it's not just in a community. You can have problems in churches that can also cause you big problems, you know, who are not doing the will of God. So now we were left with one other. Well, I'll carry this on in another video. I'll cut this one video short, and then we'll, you know, see what else, you know, develops in Kenya. Okay, God bless.